There are places in the world where the ground holds secrets that do not fit easily into the accepted understanding of human history. There are walls buried beneath sand that are older than most scholars once believed possible. There are cities that rose and flourished and fell in regions where cities were not supposed to exist at that time, in landscapes considered too dry or too remote or too early in the long unfolding of human civilization for such complexity to have taken root. There are structures whose construction required a degree of engineering knowledge and social organization that seems at first consideration to belong to a later age than the one in which they were built. These are not mysteries of a supernatural kind. They are not gaps in knowledge that invite fantastic explanations. They are simply places where the evidence of the past does not align neatly with the frameworks that researchers have used to organize the understanding of human development. And when those frameworks are examined carefully, when the evidence is studied with patience and without preconception, what often emerges is not a contradiction of human history, but a deepening and a complication of it, a picture of human beings as more inventive, more adaptable, more capable of sophisticated organization than earlier models of civilizational development had assumed. The phrase lost civilization carries with it a certain weight, a suggestion of something vast and forgotten, something buried under the accumulated years. And in many cases that weight is appropriate because the civilizations described in this account were genuinely large, genuinely sophisticated, and genuinely unknown to the people of subsequent centuries, until archaeology and careful research brought their remains back into the light. But the word lost should not be taken to imply that these places are mysterious in a way that defies understanding. They are lost in the sense that they were forgotten, not in the sense that they are inexplicable. The proper beginning of a discussion of civilizations that seem to challenge the accepted frameworks of human development is not with the most dramatic examples, but with the foundations, with the understanding of what a civilization is and what conditions are generally thought to be necessary for one to develop. Because it is only against that background that the genuinely surprising elements of the archaeological record can be appreciated for what they are. A civilization, in the sense used by researchers who study human prehistory and history, is generally understood to involve several interconnected characteristics. There is a settled population of significant size, living in permanent or semi-permanent dwellings rather than following a fully nomadic way of life. There is some degree of social differentiation, with different individuals or groups performing different roles within the society and having different levels of status or authority. There is a system for producing and distributing food that goes beyond what individual families can provide for themselves, typically involving agriculture, though in some cases, large-scale management of wild food resources can support similarly complex social arrangements. There is often, though not always, some form of large-scale construction, the building of public structures, storage facilities, ceremonial buildings, or defensive works that require the coordination of labor beyond what a single household or small group could accomplish. And there is often some form of record-keeping or symbolic communication, whether or not that takes the form of a fully developed writing system. These characteristics tend to appear together, because they are, in important ways, mutually supportive. Settled populations can support more complex social differentiation than nomadic ones. Agricultural surpluses can free some members of a society to specialize in activities other than food production, including administration, construction, and craft production. Large-scale construction projects require organizational systems that in turn require record-keeping, and so on. Caught in a web of interconnected developments that tend to reinforce each other and to produce, over time, the complex societies that researchers recognize as civilizations. The generally accepted narrative of civilizational development, as it was understood through much of the 20th century, placed the earliest civilizations in the river valleys of the Near East, in Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and in Egypt along the Nile, beginning roughly 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. In this narrative, the development of agriculture in the Fertile Crescent, roughly 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, was followed by a long period of increasingly complex village life, during which the social and technological foundations of civilization were gradually assembled, but until the threshold was crossed and the first true cities and states appeared. This narrative was not wrong. Mesopotamia and Egypt are indeed among the earliest places where urban civilization developed, and the sequence of developments in those regions, from early village farming through increasingly complex societies to the first cities and states, is well documented by archaeology. But the narrative was, as subsequent research has revealed, incomplete. It did not account for the full range and diversity of complex societies that were developing in various parts of the world, some of them earlier than expected, some of them in environments that seemed unsuited to complexity, some of them following developmental pathways quite different from those documented in the Fertile Crescent. One of the most significant challenges to the simple narrative of civilizational development came from the Indus Valley in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India. The civilization that developed there, known variously as the Indus Valley Civilization, the Harappan Civilization, or the Indus-Sarasvati Civilization, was largely unknown to the outside world until archaeological investigations in the early and middle 20th century began to reveal its extent and sophistication. When the first major cities of this civilization, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, were systematically excavated beginning in the 1920s, the researchers who uncovered them were confronted with something they had not expected: a civilization of great sophistication and enormous extent that had been entirely absent from the historical record. Mohenjo-Daro, the larger of the two first excavated cities, was a place of substantial size and remarkable organization. Its streets were laid out on a roughly grid-like plan, with broader avenues and narrower lanes dividing the city into regular blocks. Its buildings were constructed of fired brick, a technology requiring kilns and significant fuel and labor, and the bricks themselves were made to a standardized size ratio that was consistent across the entire civilization, from Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa in what is now Pakistan to sites hundreds of kilometers away in what is now India. This standardization of brick dimensions is one of the most striking features of the Indus Valley Civilization, because it implies a degree of coordination and shared technical practice across a very large geographical area. The drainage systems of Mohenjo-Daro were among the most sophisticated in the ancient world, with covered drains running beneath the streets and connecting individual houses to the main drainage channels. Bathrooms and latrines were common in the houses of Mohenjo-Daro, connected to the drainage system in a way that would not be seen in European cities for thousands of years. The Great Bath of Mohenjo-Daro, a large, watertight pool lined with fired brick and sealed with bitumen, may have served ritual or hygienic functions, and its careful construction attests to the engineering capabilities of the civilization that built it. the civilization that built Mohenjo-Daro and the other cities of the Indus Valley flourished from approximately 2,600 to around 1,900 years before the Common Era, a span of roughly 7 centuries. But its roots were deeper, with agricultural communities in the region dating back to roughly 7,000 years before the Common Era, and with the early phases of urban development, sometimes called the Early Harappan period, extending back to roughly 3,300 years before the Common Era. At its height, the Indus Valley civilization covered an area of approximately 1 million square kilometers, making it the largest of the early civilizations in terms of geographical extent, larger than either contemporary Mesopotamia or Egypt. Yet for all its size and sophistication, the Indus Valley civilization was genuinely lost for most of recorded history. Its script has not been deciphered. Its cities fell and were forgotten. The rivers that once flowed through its heartland changed their courses over the millennia, and the landscape of the region was transformed so thoroughly that the ruins of the great cities lay hidden beneath the soil for centuries, known only through the fragments of brick that local farmers occasionally dug up. When British engineers building a railway in the 19th century used the fired bricks of ancient Harappa as ballast for their railbed, they did not know they were destroying the ruins of a civilization that had been contemporary with the Old Kingdom of Egypt. The reasons for the decline of the Indus Valley civilization are still debated by researchers. The evidence suggests a gradual process over several centuries, rather than a single catastrophic event, these involving changes in the monsoon pattern that may have reduced the reliability of rainfall, the shifting of river courses that had supported agriculture, and possibly the disruption of trade networks. The great cities were progressively abandoned, their populations dispersing into smaller settlements, and the urban tradition of the Indus Valley faded away, leaving behind ruins that would not be recognized for what they were until the 20th century. The Indus Valley civilization is in some ways the paradigmatic example of a civilization that should not exist, in the sense that its existence was entirely unsuspected until excavation revealed it. Before the archaeological work of the 1920s and the decades that followed, the history of the Indian subcontinent was understood to begin with the later Vedic period and the spread of Indo-European speaking peoples into the region. The discovery of a sophisticated urban civilization predating that period, stretching across a vast area and displaying a level of urban planning and engineering that rivaled anything in the ancient world, required a fundamental revision of the understanding of South Asian prehistory. Another civilization that challenged the expected frameworks of ancient history is the civilization of the ancient Sahara. The Sahara Desert of today is the largest hot desert in the world, a vast expanse of sand and rock that stretches across the northern third of Africa, an environment of such aridity that human habitation is possible only in the narrow strips along the Nile, in the scattered oases, and in the coastal regions. The idea that this desert was once home to flourishing human communities, to herders and farmers and the artists who left remarkable images on the rock faces of what are now deeply remote and virtually inaccessible landscapes, is one that required the accumulation of substantial archaeological evidence before it was widely accepted. The key to understanding the ancient Sahara is the recognition that the desert has not always been as dry as it is today. The climate of the Sahara has varied substantially over the past 20,000 years, driven by the same orbital cycles that drove the ice ages of the Northern Hemisphere. During a period roughly between 11,000 and 5,000 years ago, the Sahara was significantly wetter than it is today, a period sometimes called the African Humid Period or the Green Sahara. During this time, the seasonal monsoon rains that today reach only the southern margins of the Sahara penetrated deep into the desert interior, supporting lakes, rivers, grasslands, and savanna woodland across much of the region that is now barren desert. In this greener Sahara, human communities flourished. Fishing communities lived along the shores of lakes that filled basins now occupied only by dry sand. Herders moved their cattle through grasslands that are now among the most desolate places on earth. The rock art of the Sahara, found on cliff faces and boulders across Libya, Algeria, Niger, Chad, and other countries, depicts a world of extraordinary biological richness. With images of cattle and horses and elephants and hippopotamuses and crocodiles and giraffes, animals that in many cases are now absent from the regions where the images were made. The rock art also depicts human figures engaged in activities including hunting, herding, dancing, and various activities that appear to have ritual or ceremonial significance. The people who made these images were not urban dwellers. They were pastoral and semi-nomadic, organized in ways that may not fit the classical definition of civilization. But they were complex societies with rich symbolic and material cultures, and their existence in the heart of what is now one of the world's most inhospitable environments is a striking illustration of how dramatically the habitability of any given landscape can change over relatively short periods of geological time. Among the most intriguing of the Saharan archaeological sites is the location known as Gobero, in what is now Niger, which was excavated in the early years of the 21st century. Gobero was a site occupied during two separate periods of the Green Sahara, the first occupation dating to roughly 10,000 years ago, and the second to roughly 8,000 years ago, separated by a drier interval during which the site was abandoned. The burials found at Gobero are remarkable in their quantity and their quality of preservation, with more than 200 individual graves identified, while including some that contained individuals buried with personal ornaments and in poses suggesting careful, deliberate interment. The site provides evidence for a substantial, settled or semi-settled human community living beside a large lake in a region that is now deep desert. The gradual drying of the Sahara, after approximately 5,000 years ago, as the orbital configuration changed and the monsoon retreated southward, forced the populations of the Green Sahara to move toward the still wet margins of the desert, toward the Nile Valley, toward the coastal regions of North Africa, toward the savanna regions of sub-Saharan Africa. Some researchers have proposed that this drying of the Sahara was one of the factors that drove the intensification of settlement and the development of complex societies along the Nile, none contributing to the conditions that produced ancient Egyptian civilization. The people who came to the Nile Valley as their own landscapes dried may have brought with them cultural knowledge, cattle herding practices, and social organizational capabilities that contributed to the rapid development of Egyptian complexity. The connection between the Green Sahara and ancient Egypt is one thread in a larger story about how environmental change has shaped the development of human civilizations. The places where civilizations developed are not always the places where the environmental conditions seem most obviously suitable for them. They are often the places where people ended up after environmental change forced them to move from the places they had previously inhabited, and bringing with them the accumulated experience and knowledge of their earlier ways of life. The site of Göbekli Tepe in what is now southeastern Turkey is perhaps the most striking single example of a place where people did things that they were not supposed to be able to do, given the standard models of human development that prevailed before its excavation. Göbekli Tepe is a site of large-scale monumental construction consisting of multiple circular and oval enclosures built from T-shaped limestone pillars, some of which stand more than 5 meters tall and weigh more than 10 metric tons. The pillars are decorated with carved reliefs depicting animals including foxes, snakes, aurochs, cranes, and various other creatures, as well as some abstract symbols. The site covers a substantial area on the top of a low hill, and excavations have revealed that the visible structures represent only a portion of the total site, with many more enclosures remaining unexcavated beneath the surface. The construction of Göbekli Tepe has been dated through a variety of methods, including radiocarbon dating of organic materials found within the deposits, to a period beginning approximately 11,600 years ago and continuing over several thousand years. This date is what makes the site so remarkable, because it places the construction of these large, elaborately decorated stone enclosures in a period before the development of agriculture, before the establishment of permanent settled villages in the region, before the pottery that is generally considered one of the markers of more complex Neolithic societies. According to the standard models of cultural evolution that prevailed before Göbekli Tepe became widely known among researchers, the construction of large-scale monuments was considered to be an activity characteristic of settled agricultural societies, which could generate the surplus food and the specialized labor that such construction requires. The idea was that you first had to establish agriculture, then villages, then social hierarchy and specialization, and only then would you have the organizational capability to build large monuments. Göbekli Tepe appears to reverse this sequence, or at least to complicate it substantially. The people who built the early phases of Göbekli Tepe were hunter-gatherers, or at most in the very earliest stages of the transition to agriculture. They were mobile or semi-mobile, living in a landscape that was, during this period, relatively well-watered and rich in wild plants and animals. The construction of the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe required the quarrying of large limestone blocks from outcrops in the vicinity, the shaping of those blocks into T-shaped pillars, the transport of the pillars to the site, and their erection and decoration. This was not a small undertaking, and it required the coordination of significant numbers of people over extended periods. The excavator of Göbekli Tepe, the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, who led work at the site from the mid-1990s until his death in 2014, proposed that the site was not a settlement, but a sanctuary, a place of gathering and ritual activity for the people of the surrounding region. In this interpretation, the construction of Göbekli Tepe was not the product of a settled community, but of periodic gatherings of hunter-gatherer groups who came together to build and maintain the enclosures and to perform whatever activities they were used for. The provision of food for these gatherings may have been one of the factors that stimulated the early experimentation with plant cultivation in the region, making Göbekli Tepe not a product of agriculture, but perhaps one of its causes. A gathering place whose needs motivated the intensification of food production that eventually led to the development of farming. This hypothesis, that ritual and symbolic activity may have been a driver of, rather than a consequence of, the development of complex society, has been one of the most influential ideas to emerge from the excavation of Göbekli Tepe, and it has stimulated a great deal of research and discussion among archaeologists studying the origins of civilization. It represents a significant shift from earlier models in which economic factors, particularly the development of agricultural surpluses, were seen as the primary drivers of social complexity. The site also raises questions about the nature of the social organization that produced it. The coordination of labor required to build the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe implies some form of authority or leadership capable of directing and maintaining cooperative work on a large scale. Whether this leadership was religious, political, or some combination of the two is not clear from the archaeological evidence. But its existence implies a degree of social organization considerably more sophisticated than that typically attributed to late Paleolithic hunter-gatherer societies, and it suggests that the transition to complex social organization was already underway before the transition to agriculture was complete. Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried, apparently by the people who used it, at some point during or after the period of its use. The enclosures were filled with soil and stone debris, a process that required enormous labor and that must have been intentional rather than accidental. The reasons for this deliberate burial are unknown, but the act itself suggests a relationship between the site and its builders that went beyond simple utilitarian construction, a relationship in which the site had a significance that warranted a kind of ritual closure at the end of its period of use. In the centuries after Göbekli Tepe was built, the surrounding region of southeastern Turkey and northern Syria and Iraq was indeed the site of some of the earliest developments in agriculture and settled village life that eventually led to the civilizations of the ancient Near East. Whether there is a direct causal connection between the gathering place of Göbekli Tepe and the subsequent development of these societies is something that continued research may eventually clarify. But the site stands as a powerful reminder that the capabilities of ancient human beings consistently exceeded what the standard models of their development had anticipated. While moving farther back in time and deeper into the question of what ancient people could accomplish, there is the evidence from the site of Jericho in the Jordan Valley, which provides some of the earliest evidence of large-scale construction in the world. The site of Jericho is one of the oldest continuously inhabited places on Earth, with evidence of human activity going back approximately 11,000 years. And the earliest phases of occupation at the site included the construction of a large stone tower and a surrounding stone wall built approximately 10,500 years ago. These structures, known as the Neolithic Tower and the associated wall, were built by people who were still in the early stages of the transition from hunter-gatherer to agricultural life. Yet they represent a substantial investment of labor in permanent stone construction. The tower at Jericho is approximately 8 meters in diameter at its base and is preserved to a height of approximately 8 meters, with an internal staircase providing access to the top. The wall that surrounded the settlement was approximately 3 to 4 meters thick and of substantial height, though its original height is uncertain. The purpose of the wall has been debated by researchers, with some proposing it was a defensive structure, and others suggesting it may have served to protect the settlement from flooding, since the Jordan Valley was a wetter and more flood-prone environment at this period than it is today. Whatever its precise function, now, the tower and wall of early Jericho represent the kind of large-scale construction effort that was supposed in earlier models to require a fully developed agricultural economy and complex social hierarchy. Yet Jericho, in this earliest period, was a community in transition, not yet fully committed to farming, not yet clearly organized in the hierarchical way associated with later urban societies. The capacity for large-scale organized construction was present even at this early stage, which suggests that the link between social complexity and construction capability is not as straightforwardly sequential as once thought. The broader picture that emerges from these early examples, from Göbekli Tepe and early Jericho and the communities of the Green Sahara, is of a human species that was, throughout the post-Ice Age period, while experimenting continuously with different forms of social organization, different relationships between mobility and settlement, different ways of relating to the landscape and its resources. Some of these experiments produced complex large-scale societies relatively quickly. Others remained at a smaller scale for long periods. The diversity of the ancient human world in the millennia between the end of the Ice Age and the rise of the first river valley civilizations was far greater than the simple narrative of civilizational development had suggested. This diversity is itself one of the most important lessons of the archaeological record of the past several decades. The human capacity for social and cultural complexity was not something that appeared suddenly with the development of agriculture or the construction of the first cities. It was present throughout the Paleolithic and Neolithic periods, expressed in different ways in different environments, constrained and enabled by different ecological and climatic conditions. The civilizations that emerged in Mesopotamia and Egypt and the Indus Valley were not the products of a sudden leap from simplicity to complexity, but of a long, slow process of social and cultural development that had been underway for tens of thousands of years before the first city was built. The long preparation for civilization is one of the most important and least appreciated aspects of the story. The development of agriculture itself, which is often treated as a threshold event, a before and after moment in human history, was in reality a prolonged and gradual process that unfolded over thousands of years in multiple regions simultaneously. With periods of advance and retreat, with communities that tried farming and then abandoned it, with the gradual accumulation of knowledge about the behavior of plants and animals that eventually made reliable agriculture possible. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were living in the middle of this long process, not at its beginning or its end, and their ability to construct large monuments was a product of the accumulated social and cognitive development of many preceding generations. The deep roots of human complexity are visible in the archaeological record in other ways as well. The mortuary practices of prehistoric communities, the ways in which they treated their dead, provide some of the clearest evidence of complex social and symbolic behavior in periods long before the development of cities or agriculture. The burials found at Gobero, already mentioned, are one example. The elaborate burials of the Natufian culture of the Levant, dating to roughly 15,000 to 11,500 years ago, are another. The Natufians, who were hunter-gatherers living in a period just before the development of agriculture, buried their dead with personal ornaments made from shells, bones, and stones, in graves that were sometimes covered with limestone slabs and that were occasionally used for multiple burials over generations. The Natufian culture is particularly interesting in the context of the story of early complexity, because it represents a form of semi-sedentary life based on the intensive exploitation of wild plants and animals without the practice of deliberate cultivation. The Natufians lived in substantial stone-built houses in some locations, with evidence of long-term occupation of individual sites, suggesting a degree of sedentism unusual for hunter-gatherers. Their exploitation of wild cereals, particularly wild wheat and barley, was so intensive that it left a distinctive mark in the archaeological record in the form of groundstone tools for processing grain and flint sickle blades with the characteristic sheen that results from cutting the silica-rich stems of cereal plants. The Natufian way of life was a precursor to agriculture in the sense that it involved an intensive relationship with the plants that would eventually be domesticated, and it was supported by a semi-settled social organization that provided the context in which deliberate cultivation could develop. But it was also a dead end in some ways, because the Natufian communities were highly dependent on the particular environmental conditions of the late Pleistocene and early Holocene Levant. And when those conditions changed, as they did during the cold, dry Younger Dryas period, many Natufian sites were abandoned and the population retreated to smaller, more mobile groups. The Younger Dryas appears to have been one of the factors that ultimately pushed post-Natufian communities toward deliberate cultivation, as the reduction in wild plant productivity made the practice of planting and tending crops more attractive as a supplement or replacement for wild harvesting. This back and forth between complexity and simplicity, between settled and mobile ways of life, now is a characteristic of the archaeological record of the prehistoric period that is often overlooked in summary accounts of the development of civilization. The path from hunter-gatherer to farmer to urban dweller was not a straight one, and many societies took detours, backtracked combined elements of different ways of life in ways that did not fit neatly into any single developmental stage. The civilizations that eventually emerged were built on this long history of experimentation and adaptation, and their apparently sudden appearance in the archaeological record is, on closer examination, the culmination of processes that had been developing for millennia. As the first part of this account draws toward its natural resting place, it is worth pausing to appreciate the full weight of what has been described. But the civilizations that seem most surprising, most out of place in the standard narratives of human development, are not anomalies or exceptions to the general pattern. They are, rather, the most visible expressions of a much broader pattern of human capability and adaptability that was present throughout the prehistoric period in all its geographic and cultural diversity. The Indus Valley civilization was not an improbable development. It was the product of several thousand years of agricultural and social development in the South Asian subcontinent, a development that had its own trajectory and its own character, different from but no less sophisticated than the roughly contemporary developments in Mesopotamia and Egypt. The communities of the Green Sahara were not anomalies in a desert landscape. They were the natural inhabitants of a wetter, richer environment that simply no longer exists, and their displacement by the drying of the Sahara was part of the process that redistributed populations and contributed to the development of new complex societies elsewhere. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were not isolated geniuses working against the grain of their time. They were members of a broad regional culture that was in the midst of a major social and economic transition, and their monument was an expression of the social capabilities that transition both required and produced. The story of lost civilizations is, at its foundation, a story about the underestimated depth and breadth of human capability throughout the prehistoric period. and about the ways in which the physical environment, in all its variability and unpredictability, has shaped the development of human societies in every part of the world. The lost civilizations of the ancient world are lost not because they were impossible, but because they existed in conditions that no longer prevail, and were forgotten in the long interval between their flourishing and the development of the scholarly tools that could recover their memory. They rest now in the layers of soil and sand that cover them, patient and quiet, waiting for the slow work of excavation to bring them gradually, carefully back into the light. The account of lost civilizations extends beyond the familiar regions of the Near East and South Asia to include places that seem, at first encounter, even less likely settings for complex human societies. In the jungles of Southeast Asia, beneath the dense canopy of the Cambodian forest, there once stood a city that may have been, at its height, the largest pre-industrial urban settlement in the history of the world. In the high altitudes of the Andes, long before the Inca, cultures developed sophisticated agricultural and hydraulic engineering on a scale that still impresses careful observers today. In sub-Saharan Africa, in a region considered by many outside observers to have been without large-scale urban traditions, cities of stone were built that were inhabited for centuries and whose ruins remain as silent testimony to a history that was long obscured by prejudice and ignorance. Each of these cases is, in its own way, a story of recovery, of knowledge lost and then found again through the patient work of researchers, local scholars, and the communities whose ancestors built what was forgotten. The great city of Angkor, in what is now Cambodia, is perhaps the most extensively documented of the ancient urban centers that have surprised researchers with their scale and sophistication. The temple complex of Angkor Wat, the largest religious monument ever constructed, is well known enough that it has never been truly lost in the sense of being unknown to the outside world, but the full extent of the civilization of which it was a part. The Khmer Empire of the 9th through 15th centuries of the Common Era was understood only gradually, and the true scale of the urban landscape surrounding the famous temple complexes was revealed only through modern remote sensing technology in the first 2 decades of the 21st century. Using LiDAR technology, which uses laser pulses from aircraft to map the ground surface beneath forest vegetation, researchers were able to see through the jungle canopy that covers most of the Angkor region and map the landscape beneath it in extraordinary detail. What the LiDAR surveys revealed was that the city of Angkor was not simply the collection of temple complexes that had long been known, impressive as those were. It was a vast urban landscape extending over approximately 1,000 square kilometers, with a grid of roads and canals, a sophisticated water management system of reservoirs and channels, and the remains of densely packed residential areas extending far beyond the monumental core. At its height, Angkor may have supported a population of between 500,000 and 1 million people, making it one of the largest urban centers in the medieval world. The water management system of Angkor was one of the civilization's most significant achievements, and its study has revealed both the sophistication and the ultimate fragility of the Khmer urban system. The region around Angkor receives its rainfall during a single wet season and is essentially dry for the remainder of the year. To support a large urban population and the intensive agriculture needed to feed it, the Khmer engineers constructed an elaborate system of reservoirs and canals that captured the wet season rains and distributed them throughout the dry season. The largest of these reservoirs, the West Baray, is approximately 8 kilometers long and 2.5 kilometers wide, one of the largest man-made reservoirs in the ancient world. The system worked for several centuries, supporting the remarkable cultural and political achievements of the Khmer Empire and the construction of the temple complexes that remain one of the great architectural achievements of human history. But the system was also vulnerable to the variability of the monsoon. And research using tree ring records and other paleoclimate proxies has revealed that the region experienced a series of severe droughts and intense floods during the 14th and 15th centuries of the Common Era, alternating in ways that would have placed enormous stress on the hydraulic infrastructure. The evidence from the Angkor waterworks themselves shows signs of hasty repairs and improvised modifications, suggesting that the engineers of the later Khmer period were struggling to maintain a system that was being overwhelmed by unusual climatic conditions. The decline of Angkor appears to have involved not a single catastrophic event, but a prolonged weakening of the hydraulic system under the combined pressure of climatic variability, population growth, and possibly the organizational and political difficulties of maintaining a complex engineering system across a large empire. The population of the city gradually dispersed, the canals silted up, and the reservoirs lost their capacity, and the jungle advanced over the residential areas and the roads, leaving only the great stone temples, too massive and too solidly constructed to be easily reclaimed by the vegetation, as visible reminders of what had once been there. The story of Angkor is instructive in several respects. It demonstrates that very large, sophisticated urban systems could develop in tropical forest environments that are sometimes assumed to be hostile to complex civilization because of the difficulty of agriculture in leached tropical soils and the challenges of maintaining infrastructure in a hot, wet environment. It demonstrates the ingenuity with which the Khmer engineers addressed these challenges, building a water management system that transformed an environmentally challenging landscape into one capable of supporting a very large population. And it demonstrates, again, the vulnerability of complex civilizations to climatic change, particularly to changes in the reliability and timing of rainfall in regions where agriculture depends on a well-functioning hydraulic system. The civilization of Angkor was not lost in the sense of being unknown to its neighbors or to later inhabitants of the region. Cambodian society maintained continuity with the Khmer tradition through the period of Angkor's decline, and the temples were never entirely abandoned. But the full scale and sophistication of the urban landscape was genuinely unknown until the LiDAR surveys of the early 21st century revealed it, and the story of the Khmer hydraulic system and its role in both the success and the eventual decline of the civilization is one that had been assembled from archaeological and paleoclimate evidence in relatively recent years. The case of Great Zimbabwe is a different kind of story, one in which the reality of an ancient African urban civilization was visible in the form of still-standing stone ruins, but in which a combination of prejudice and ideological predisposition led outside observers for many years to attribute the ruins to any culture other than the African people who had actually built them. Great Zimbabwe. The most extensive of a class of stone-walled enclosures found across parts of southern Africa, was occupied from roughly the 11th to the 15th centuries of the Common Era, and at its height was the capital of a significant regional state that controlled trade routes in gold and other commodities across a wide area. The ruins of Great Zimbabwe consist of several distinct areas: the most impressive of which are the Hill Complex, an enclosure built on a granite hilltop, and the Great Enclosure, a massive stone-walled structure in the valley below. The Great Enclosure is the largest ancient stone structure in sub-Saharan Africa, with walls reaching up to 11 meters in height and 5 meters in thickness at the base, constructed without mortar from carefully selected and fitted granite blocks. Inside the Great Enclosure is a tall, solid stone tower, approximately 10 meters in height, whose function has been debated by researchers, but which was clearly a significant architectural statement. The stone walls of Great Zimbabwe are remarkable for the quality of their construction. The builders selected granite blocks of consistent thickness from the natural layering of granite outcrops in the region and laid them in courses of regular height without the use of mortar. The precision of the fitting and the quality of the coursing in the finest sections of the walls is a testament to the skill of the builders who developed a masonry tradition quite different from that of the ancient Near East or the Mediterranean, but no less technically accomplished in its own terms. Now, the state whose capital, Great Zimbabwe, appears to have derived its wealth primarily from its control of the gold trade between the interior of southern Africa and the East African coast, where Arab and Swahili traders had established a network of commercial towns. Gold mined in the interior was traded through Great Zimbabwe and its subordinate centers to the coast, where it was exchanged for glass beads, porcelain, and other luxury goods from across the Indian Ocean trading world. Chinese porcelain and glass beads from the Middle East, found in the ruins of Great Zimbabwe, attest to the participation of the city in this long-distance trading network. The Zimbabwe culture, as the broader civilization of which Great Zimbabwe was the center, is known. Bina was one of several sophisticated state-level societies that developed in sub-Saharan Africa in the first and second millennia of the Common Era. It was built on the foundation of the cattle herding and farming societies that had inhabited the region for several centuries before the emergence of the Great Stone Enclosures, and it represented a degree of social complexity and political organization that was, and in some quarters continues to be, unexpected from a region that was long stereotyped as being without a significant pre-colonial history. The suppression of the African origin of Great Zimbabwe by early colonial-era investigators who insisted that the ruins had been built by Phoenicians or ancient Arabs or some other non-African people. B is a well-documented chapter in the history of archaeology that is now universally recognized as reflecting the racial prejudices of the investigators rather than any serious consideration of the evidence. The evidence for the African origin of the Zimbabwe culture was always available to those who examined it without preconception, and by the mid-20th century, academic archaeologists had established the facts of the case clearly. The process of restoring the history of Great Zimbabwe and the Zimbabwe culture to its proper place in the understanding of African and world history has been a gradual one, and it continues as new research reveals more about the extent and sophistication of the civilization that built those walls. Moving to the Americas, the picture of ancient civilization that emerges from recent decades of research is one of extraordinary diversity and sophistication, much of which was unknown or poorly understood by scholars of the 20th century. The civilizations of Mesoamerica, the Maya and the Aztec and their predecessors, have long been recognized as among the most sophisticated of the ancient world. But even these well-known civilizations have continued to yield surprises as new research methods are applied. The Maya, who developed one of the most sophisticated writing systems in the ancient world and made precise astronomical observations that informed a complex calendrical system, have been studied by archaeologists since the 19th century. But the LIDAR surveys of the Maya lowlands that began in earnest in the second decade of the 21st century revealed, as the Angkor surveys had done in Southeast Asia, that the scale of Maya urban settlement was far larger than surface observation and traditional archaeology had suggested. Dense networks of roads, causeways, agricultural terraces, and drainage canals connected Maya cities into an integrated landscape that covered enormous areas of what is now jungle, a landscape that was, during the classic Maya period of roughly the 3rd through 9th centuries of the Common Era, extensively modified and managed by large human populations. The agricultural systems of the Maya are themselves a remarkable achievement. The lowland Maya heartland is a flat limestone plain with thin, rocky soils and a strongly seasonal rainfall pattern. It is not, on the surface, an ideal agricultural landscape, yet the Maya supported large and dense populations in this landscape through a combination of techniques including the construction of raised fields in wetland areas, the creation of terrace systems on slopes, the management of forest edges to maintain productive mixtures of cultivated and semi-wild plant species, and the construction of reservoirs and cisterns to store rainwater through the dry season. This intensive land management transformed a challenging natural landscape into one capable of sustaining millions of people. The decline of the classic Maya civilization, which occurred during the 9th and 10th centuries of the Common Era and involved the abandonment of most major lowland cities over a period of roughly 1 to 2 centuries, has been one of the most intensively studied collapse events in archaeology. The causes appear to be multiple and interacting, including a series of severe droughts documented in the paleoclimate record, the political fragmentation of the lowland Maya world into competing city-states that fought each other rather than cooperating, and the environmental degradation that resulted from the intensive exploitation of the natural resources of the lowland landscape by very large populations. The story of the classic Maya decline is another example of the vulnerability of sophisticated civilizations to the intersection of environmental stress and social conflict, a pattern that recurs repeatedly in the history of complex societies. In South America, the civilizations of the Andes present a different picture of complexity and achievement, one that developed in an environment of extreme challenge and extraordinary diversity. The Andes are one of the most varied and difficult landscapes on Earth, with the high-altitude plateau of the Altiplano, the steep and narrow valleys of the western slopes, the coastal desert of the Pacific shore, and the humid eastern slopes descending into the Amazon basin, all lying within short distances of each other. The civilizations that developed in this landscape had to contend with altitude, aridity, cold, and the ever-present risk of earthquakes, floods, and volcanic eruptions, as well as the challenges of connecting communities separated by enormous topographic differences. The Tiwanaku civilization, which flourished from roughly the 4th through the 11th centuries of the Common Era on the high altiplano of what is now Bolivia and Peru, is one of the most remarkable examples of complex civilization in a challenging environment. The city of Tiwanaku itself, located at an altitude of approximately 3,800 meters above sea level, was one of the highest urban centers in the ancient world, and its agricultural hinterland on the Altiplano included some of the highest altitude farmland ever cultivated by a significant population. The agricultural system that supported Tiwanaku is among the most ingenious human responses to environmental challenge in the archaeological record. Sina, the Altiplano, is prone to frosts that can destroy crops even during the growing season because of the altitude and the thin atmosphere. The Tiwanaku farmers addressed this challenge by constructing an elaborate system of raised fields, known in Quechua as sucacollos, in the shallow lakeside areas and periodically flooded plains around Lake Titicaca. The raised fields consisted of platforms of soil raised above the level of the surrounding plain, separated by channels of water. During the day, the water in the channels absorbed solar heat. At night, this stored heat was released, moderating the temperature in the air above the fields and reducing the frequency and severity of frost damage. The raised field system also improved drainage, reduced waterlogging, and allowed the organic sediments that accumulated in the channels to be dredged and used to fertilize the raised platforms. Modern experiments in which the raised field system has been reconstructed in the area around Lake Titicaca have demonstrated that it is highly effective, capable of supporting significantly higher agricultural yields than conventional farming in the same environment, and with substantially better resistance to frost. The fact that this sophisticated system was abandoned after the decline of Tiwanaku and not revived for centuries, until archaeologists working with local communities demonstrated its effectiveness, is itself a reminder of how much knowledge can be lost when a complex civilization declines. Tiwanaku also produced remarkable monumental architecture, including large stone platforms, sunken courts, and finely constructed stone gateways, the most famous of which is the Gate of the Sun, a single piece of andesitic volcanic rock weighing an estimated 10 metric tons, carved with elaborate bas-relief decorations. The construction techniques used in Tiwanaku architecture, including the use of metal clamps to connect adjacent stone blocks, and the precise fitting of large stones without mortar, reflect a masonry tradition of high sophistication. The spread of Tiwanaku influence across a large area of the south-central Andes was not achieved primarily through military conquest, as far as the archaeological record reveals, but through the extension of a religious and economic network, with Tiwanaku serving as a pilgrimage center and a hub of long-distance exchange. Tiwanaku-style ceramics, textiles, and iconography are found across a wide area of what are now Bolivia, Peru, Chile, and Argentina, reflecting the reach of the civilization's cultural influence, even in areas where Tiwanaku political control may not have been direct. The decline of Tiwanaku, which occurred around the 11th century of the Common Era, appears to have been driven in significant part by a prolonged drought, documented in cores from the sediments of Lake Titicaca and in the ice cores from the Quelcaya ice cap in Peru. The Altiplano is a semi-arid environment at the best of times, and the raised field agriculture that supported Tiwanaku depended on adequate water in the channels between the raised platforms. A sustained reduction in precipitation would have made the maintenance of the raised field system increasingly difficult, reducing agricultural productivity and eventually making the dense population of the Tiwanaku heartland unsustainable. The Norte Chico or Corral Soup civilization of coastal Peru is another South American case that challenges standard narratives of civilizational development. The Norte Chico civilization, which flourished from approximately 3,000 to approximately 1,800 years before the Common Era, developed in the narrow river valleys of the coastal desert of northern Peru. an extremely arid environment where agriculture was possible only through irrigation. The sites of this civilization, including the large site of Caral in the Soup Valley, contain impressive monumental architecture including large platform mounds, sunken circular plazas in residential areas, for all of which require substantial labor investment and organizational capability. What makes the Norte Chico civilization particularly notable is that it appears to have been one of the earliest examples of complex urban society in the Americas, with a developmental chronology comparable in some respects to the early civilizations of the Old World. The platform mounds at Caral, the largest of which rises approximately 18 meters and covers an area of approximately 150 by 160 meters, were built and used over several centuries, beginning approximately 2,600 years before the Common Era, making them roughly contemporary with the Old Kingdom of Egypt and the early phases of Mesopotamian urbanism. Now, the Norte Chico civilization was unusual in that it does not appear to have had a tradition of ceramic pottery in its early phases, and the evidence for writing or formal record-keeping systems comparable to those of Mesopotamia or Egypt is limited. But it had a sophisticated system of textile production, with evidence for the cultivation of cotton, which was apparently used primarily for fishing nets and other equipment rather than for clothing, suggesting an economy in which the fishing resources of the Pacific coast played a central role alongside the irrigated agriculture of the river valleys. The relationship between the fishing economy of the coast and the agricultural economy of the river valleys appears to have been the economic foundation of Norte Chico complexity. The fishermen of the coast traded their catch, including the anchovies that are still a significant resource of the Peruvian current, for the products of the inland farmers, and this exchange supported both populations and created the surpluses that funded the construction of the monumental centers. The Norte Chico civilization developed its complexity not on the basis of grain surpluses alone, as the Standard Model had assumed, but on the basis of a diversified coastal and agricultural economy that had its own character and its own logic. The recovery of Norte Chico from obscurity has been a relatively recent development in archaeology, with the full extent of the civilization's antiquity and complexity not becoming clear until the early years of the 21st century, when systematic radiocarbon dating of the major sites established their remarkable age. Before that dating, the large mounds of the Soup Valley and adjacent valleys were recognized as ancient, but their chronological position was uncertain, and the absence of ceramics made them difficult to place within the standard chronological frameworks developed for other parts of the Andes. Once the dates were established, the Norte Chico civilization required a fundamental reassessment of the timeline of civilizational development in the Americas. These examples from Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and South America illustrate a broader pattern in the archaeology of the past few decades, the consistent finding that complex civilization developed in more places at earlier dates and in more diverse environments than was previously understood. Each new example of early complexity adds to a picture of human social development as a genuinely global phenomenon, not a single thread traced from the Fertile Crescent outward, but a multiplicity of independent and semi-independent developments, each shaped by its own environmental context and its own cultural traditions, each contributing in different ways to the full range of human social possibility. The Bronze Age civilizations of the Aegean also offer instances where the depth and breadth of complexity has repeatedly surprised researchers. The Minoan civilization of Crete, which flourished from roughly 3,000 to roughly 1,400 years before the Common Era, developed a sophisticated palace-based economy, a tradition of elaborate painted pottery and fresco decoration, and a script called Linear A, which has not yet been deciphered. The Minoan palaces, of which Knossos is the most famous, were large, complex structures with multiple stories, elaborate drainage systems, storerooms for agricultural products, workshops for craft production, and spaces for what appear to have been religious activities, all organized around central courtyards in a distinctive architectural tradition found nowhere else in the ancient world. The Minoans were connected to the broader Mediterranean world through trade, and their influence on the subsequent development of Greek civilization was substantial. The Linear B script used by the later Mycenaean Greeks was derived from Linear A, and elements of Minoan religion and iconography appear in later Greek mythology and religious practice. But the Minoan civilization itself declined and was eventually absorbed into the broader Aegean world during the second millennium before the Common Era, and its records, written in the still undeciphered Linear A script, remain inaccessible to direct reading. The civilization of the ancient Harappans, already discussed at some length, shared with the Minoans the characteristic of possessing a writing system that has not been deciphered, and this parallel is one of the many intriguing aspects of these civilizations that give them an air of lasting mystery. The Indus script, found on seals, pottery, and other objects from Harappan sites, consists of short sequences of signs, rarely more than 10 in length, that have resisted all attempts at decipherment. Whether the Indus script represents a full writing system capable of recording language, or a more limited system of symbols for administrative or identifying purposes, is itself a matter of debate among researchers. The difficulty of deciphering ancient scripts is a reminder that the knowledge of ancient civilizations is always partial, always filtered through what has survived and what can be recovered from what has survived. Writing, where it has been deciphered, provides a window into the thoughts and intentions of ancient peoples that no other type of evidence can match. But even writing records only a small fraction of what actually happened in any civilization, focus typically on administrative matters, royal proclamations, and religious texts, rather than on the daily life and experience of most of the population. And many ancient civilizations either did not have writing or had writing systems that have not survived, leaving researchers entirely dependent on the mute evidence of archaeology. The mute evidence of archaeology is, however, more eloquent than it might seem. The careful study of the material, remains of past civilizations, their pottery and their buildings and their burials and their tools and their agricultural systems and their trade goods, can reveal a great deal about the organization of those civilizations, their economies, and their social structures, and their relationships with the natural world. The methods of archaeology have become increasingly sophisticated over the past century, incorporating techniques from geology, chemistry, biology, physics, and computer science, and the information that can be extracted from ancient materials continues to increase as these methods develop. The ancient DNA analysis that has revolutionized the understanding of prehistoric population movements is one of the most significant recent developments in archaeology. By extracting and sequencing DNA from the bones of ancient people, researchers have been able to reconstruct the genetic history of ancient populations, tracing migrations and mixtures between different groups across thousands of years. This method has revealed, among other things, the extraordinary complexity of the population history of the ancient world, with multiple waves of migration and admixture, creating the populations of historical civilizations from combinations of earlier groups that were themselves highly diverse. The genetic analysis of ancient populations in the Indus Valley, for example, has revealed that the people who built the Harappan cities were themselves a mixture of different ancestral populations, including a component related to ancient Iranian farmers and a component related to the hunter-gatherers of South Asia, as well as possibly other groups. The mixing of these populations to produce the Harappan people occurred before the urban phase of the civilization, during the earlier agricultural villages that preceded the cities, suggesting that the biological and cultural mixing that contributed to the development of Harappan urban life was itself a product of the long period of preparation that preceded it. Similarly, the ancient DNA analysis of Maya populations has revealed patterns of genetic diversity and population history that complement the archaeological understanding of Maya society, and analysis of ancient populations from the Andes is beginning to reveal the complex population history of that region across the period when the great Andean civilizations were developing. These genetic studies do not replace the traditional methods of archaeology, but add another layer of evidence to the picture of ancient human societies, a layer that can reveal aspects of those societies that are invisible in the purely material record. The technology of isotope analysis has also contributed significantly to the understanding of ancient civilizations. By measuring the ratios of different stable isotopes in the bones and teeth of ancient people, researchers can determine where those people grew up, what they ate, and in some cases how their diet changed over the course of their lives. This technique has been used to identify individuals who migrated to a city from distant regions, to reconstruct the diets of different social classes within ancient cities, and to trace the movement of trade goods across long distances by matching the isotopic signatures of materials to the geological sources from which they came. The picture of ancient trade networks that has emerged from isotope analysis and from the archaeological identification of non-local materials in ancient sites is one of extraordinary extent and complexity. Long-distance trade in the ancient world was not a marginal activity. It was a central feature of the economies of many complex societies, after providing essential materials that could not be obtained locally, creating and maintaining social connections between distant communities, and generating the kind of economic specialization that supported the development of complex social hierarchies. The lapis lazuli from Afghanistan found in Mesopotamian burials, the copper from Cyprus traded across the Mediterranean, the gold and ivory of sub-Saharan Africa that appeared in the markets of the ancient Near East, the obsidian from volcanic sources in Anatolia that was distributed across the Neolithic Near East, all of these are testimony to the reach and sophistication of ancient long-distance exchange. The study of ancient trade networks is also relevant to the understanding of lost civilizations. None because trade connections are one of the ways in which the knowledge and techniques of complex societies spread from one region to another. The development of agriculture, of metallurgy, of writing, and of other fundamental technologies was not simply a matter of independent invention in multiple locations. It involved the movement of ideas and techniques along trade networks, the adoption and adaptation of practices observed in distant places, the intermarriage and migration that mixed populations and their cultural knowledge. The civilizations of the ancient world were not isolated flowers blooming in separate gardens, but participants in a complex web of interaction that spanned continents and oceans. The extent of ancient maritime trade is one of the most surprising findings of recent archaeological research. The idea that people of the ancient world were limited in their maritime capabilities, unable to make long open ocean voyages, has been repeatedly contradicted by evidence of ancient contacts across open water. The colonization of Australia by the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians, which occurred approximately 65,000 years ago, required water crossings of at least 60 to 90 kilometers across open sea, at a time when sea levels were lower than today, but when several water crossings were still necessary. The settlement of the Pacific Islands by Polynesian navigators, beginning around 3,000 years ago and completing the colonization of the entire Pacific, including the most remote islands of Hawaii and Easter Island and New Zealand, by approximately 1,000 years ago, represents one of the most remarkable feats of maritime navigation in human history. The Polynesian navigators who settled the Pacific did so without instruments, using a sophisticated system of navigation based on the stars, the patterns of ocean swells, the behavior of birds, the appearance of clouds over islands, and accumulated knowledge passed from generation to generation in oral traditions. They sailed outrigger canoes thousands of kilometers across open ocean, in vessels whose construction and rigging reflected centuries of accumulated technological development. The fact that this was accomplished by people who left no written records and built no stone cities of the kind associated with other complex civilizations is a reminder of the diversity of forms that human complexity can take. In all of these cases, from the great hydraulic civilization of the Khmer to the raised field farmers of the Altiplano to the Pacific navigators, the common thread is the underestimated depth of human capability and adaptability. The civilizations that seem most unlikely are, on examination, the most interesting examples of the human capacity to develop sophisticated solutions to the challenges posed by specific environments and specific historical circumstances. Their loss to memory, their burial under soil and jungle and the accumulating layers of time was not a natural inevitability, but the product of specific historical processes of conquest and abandonment and the forgetting that follows the disruption of cultural continuity. The recovery of these lost civilizations is itself a kind of civilizational act, a collective effort of research and scholarship, and sometimes community involvement that restores to the human record the full range and richness of what human beings have been able to accomplish in the long span of time since the last ice age. Each excavation, each analysis, each new reading of an ancient text or reinterpretation of a set of ruins adds to the accumulating picture of a past far more complex and far more varied than any simple narrative could contain. And the picture is still incomplete. There are certainly lost civilizations that have not yet been found, buried too deeply or located in regions too little studied for their traces to have come to light. The application of new technologies, from LiDAR surveys of forested regions to the chemical analysis of ancient soils, he continues to reveal new sites and new evidence for ancient complexity in unexpected places. The story of lost civilizations is not a completed story. It is an ongoing investigation, patient and careful, and always open to the surprise of the next discovery. The oldest of the known complex societies leave their mark not only in stone and pottery, but in the long transformation of the landscapes they inhabited. Civilizations change their environments, sometimes subtly and sometimes profoundly, and the traces of those changes persist long after the civilizations themselves have faded. In many parts of the world, the careful study of soil chemistry, forest composition, and landscape morphology reveals the hand of ancient human management in places that appear at first sight to be pristine natural environments. This deep human mark on the landscape is one of the most important and least appreciated legacies of the lost civilizations of the ancient world. The forests of the Amazon basin present one of the most striking examples of this phenomenon. The Amazon rainforest has long been seen as a wilderness, a natural environment of immense biological richness, but without a significant human past of the kind associated with complex civilization. The conventional view, established in the mid-20th century and influential for several decades, was that the soils of the Amazon were too poor, too thoroughly leached by the heavy rainfall to support dense agricultural populations, and that the indigenous peoples of the Amazon had therefore always lived in small, dispersed groups, practicing a simple form of shifting cultivation. This view has been substantially revised in recent decades, as archaeological research across the Amazon basin has revealed evidence for much larger, more complex, and more densely settled pre-colonial societies than the conventional model had allowed. The evidence comes from multiple sources: the discovery of large, geometrically shaped earthworks in regions that are seasonally flooded or covered in forest, the analysis of the distinctive dark soils called Amazonian dark earths, or terra preta, and the careful study of the forest composition in areas long inhabited by human communities. The Amazonian dark earths are among the most remarkable features of the Amazonian archaeological record. These soils, found in patches of varying size across the Amazon basin, are distinguished from the typical poor, yellowish-red soils of the region by their dark color, their high content of organic matter and charcoal, and their exceptional fertility. They are found in association with archaeological remains, including pottery and other artifacts, and they appear to be the product of deliberate soil improvement by ancient populations who created them by adding charcoal, organic matter, and other materials to the naturally poor soils of the region over periods of many generations. The deliberate creation of these fertile soils was a form of agricultural engineering that allowed pre-colonial Amazonian populations to support much denser settlements than the natural soil conditions would have permitted. The terra preta soils are self-renewing to some degree because the charcoal they contain creates a stable carbon structure that promotes microbial activity and retains nutrients, unlike the organic matter of conventional soils that breaks down rapidly in the hot, wet Amazon climate. The ancient Amazonian farmers who created these soils were, in a very real sense, manufacturing their own agricultural substrate, a form of land improvement that required significant knowledge, labor, and long-term planning. The earthworks of the Amazon are similarly impressive. In the upper reaches of the Amazon basin, in what is now the Brazilian state of Acre and adjacent areas, large geometric earthworks have been discovered beneath the forest cover, revealed by forest clearing for agriculture and by aerial and satellite imagery. These earthworks, called geoglyphs, consist of ditches and banks arranged in geometric patterns, including circles, squares, and combinations of these shapes, covering areas of 100 to 300 meters in diameter. They number in the hundreds and perhaps thousands, distributed across a large area of southwestern Amazonia. The function of the Amazonian geoglyphs is not entirely clear, and researchers have proposed various interpretations, including ceremonial and gathering places, defensive works, or landscape markers of various kinds. What is clear is that their construction required organized labor on a significant scale, and their distribution across a wide area implies a society or network of societies with shared cultural practices and the organizational capability to undertake large construction projects. The age of the geoglyphs, established through radiocarbon dating, ranges from roughly 2,000 to roughly 1,000 years before the Common Era in some cases, and somewhat more recently in others, indicating that the construction of these features was a long-lived practice in the region. The picture of pre-colonial Amazonia that has emerged from these and other findings is of a landscape that was extensively managed by large human populations over many centuries, a landscape in which the forest itself was shaped by human activity, with useful trees and plants encouraged and less useful ones suppressed, creating a kind of garden forest that was rich in food and other resources, but that appeared natural to later observers unfamiliar with the history of human management that had shaped it. Some researchers have described the Amazon basin of the period just before European contact as a cultural forest, a landscape so thoroughly modified by centuries of human occupation and management that it no longer represented the natural state of the region. This interpretation has implications for the understanding of the extraordinary biological richness of the Amazon basin. While much of that richness is certainly the product of the long evolutionary history of the region, some of the patterns of plant distribution and diversity in the Amazon may also reflect the legacy of ancient human cultivation and management, which introduced useful plants to new areas, created forest gaps and edges that favored particular species, and in general shaped the forest composition in ways that have persisted for centuries after the depopulation that followed European contact and the diseases it brought. The depopulation of the Americas following European contact in the late 15th century is itself a significant factor in the understanding of lost American civilizations. The indigenous populations of the Americas, from north to south, suffered catastrophic mortality from the epidemic diseases that Europeans introduced, diseases against which indigenous populations had no inherited immunity because those diseases had not been present in the Americas before European contact. Estimates of the population loss vary widely and are debated among scholars, but the mortality in some regions over the century following initial contact may have been 60 to 90% or more of the pre-contact population. This catastrophic mortality meant that many of the complex societies of the Americas, some of which had already been weakened or transformed by the political upheavals that followed the Spanish conquests of Mexico and Peru, simply ceased to exist as functioning entities within a century or two of first European contact. Their oral traditions, their agricultural knowledge, their social structures, their engineering techniques, many of these were lost or severely disrupted as the populations that carried them collapsed. The ruins of their cities and the earthworks at their landscapes survived, but the living knowledge that would have made those ruins fully comprehensible was largely gone. The archaeology of the pre-contact Americas is therefore an archaeology of reconstruction. An attempt to understand civilizations from their material remains in the absence of the kind of documentary record that is available for some Old World civilizations. In this respect, it shares characteristics with the archaeology of other lost civilizations discussed in this account. Be the Harapans with their undeciphered script, the builders of Göbekli Tepe who left no writing at all, the people of the Green Sahara whose rock art speaks volumes, but whose words are gone. The silence of these ancient records is not a counsel to stop trying to understand them. It is an invitation to bring the full range of archaeological method to bear on the material they left behind. The ancient city of Teotihuacan, in the high valley of Mexico, is an example of a civilization that was already ancient and already mysterious when the later Aztec civilization encountered its ruins and incorporated them into their own mythology. Teotihuacan was built and occupied from roughly the 1st century before the Common Era to roughly the 6th or 7th century of the Common Era, a period of approximately 6 to 7 centuries, during which it grew to become one of the largest cities in the world, with a population estimated at between 100,000 and 200,000 people at its height, making it comparable in size to contemporary Rome. The layout of Teotihuacan is remarkable for its scale and its geometric precision. The city is organized around a broad central avenue, known as the Avenue of the Dead, running for approximately 4 kilometers from north to south, with the Great Pyramid of the Moon at its northern end, and the Citadel and Temple of Quetzalcoatl at its southern end. Along and near this avenue, the Pyramid of the Sun, one of the largest structures ever built in the ancient Americas, rises approximately 63 meters to its apex and covers a base of approximately 220 by 230 meters. The city extends for several kilometers on either side of the Avenue of the Dead, with the residential areas organized in large multi-family apartment compounds of a distinctive architectural form found almost nowhere else in the ancient world. The people of Teotihuacan are not identified by name in the historical records of any contemporary civilization, and the language or languages they spoke are unknown. The city's name, which means the place where the gods were made or the place where men became gods, is an Aztec name given to the already ancient ruins 1,000 years after the city's decline, and it reflects the awe with which the Aztec regarded the remains of a civilization they knew had preceded them, but whose true nature was already beyond their direct knowledge. Teotihuacan exerted enormous cultural and political influence across Mesoamerica during its height. Its architectural styles, its iconography, and its material goods are found across a wide area of Mexico and Central America, and there is evidence of Teotihuacan presence in the Maya lowlands, where some inscriptions record individuals associated with the central Mexican city, appearing as political actors in Maya cities hundreds of kilometers away. Whether this reflects direct conquest, political alliance, or the movement of traders and emissaries is debated, but it indicates the reach of Teotihuacan's influence across what was clearly a connected Mesoamerican world. The decline of Teotihuacan, which appears to have begun around the 6th century of the Common Era and accelerated in the 7th, involved the burning and destruction of the ceremonial center of the city, a destruction that left clear traces in the archaeological record in the form of fire-damaged structures and the deliberate toppling of monuments. The cause of this destruction is not certain. It may have been the result of an internal revolt, with the population turning on the elite who had organized and presumably benefited from the city's economic and political system. It may have been the result of external attack by competing polities, or some combination of internal and external factors. After the destruction of the ceremonial center, the city was rapidly depopulated, and by the time the Aztec encountered its ruins, several centuries later, The city was uninhabited and its builders forgotten. The mystery of who built Teotihuacan, what language they spoke, and why their city declined so rapidly after its long period of dominance remains one of the central unresolved questions of Mesoamerican archaeology. Recent research using isotope analysis to study the origins of individuals buried at the city and DNA analysis of skeletal remains has begun to shed light on the genetic and geographic diversity of the city's population, suggesting that Teotihuacan was a genuinely cosmopolitan city, drawing populations from many different regions of Mesoamerica. But the identity of its founders and the nature of its political and religious system remain subjects of active research and ongoing debate. The ancient city of Mohenjo-Daro, already discussed in the first part of this account, and shares with Teotihuacan the characteristic of being a major ancient city whose builders and language and political organization are largely unknown. The similarity between the two cases, separated by thousands of kilometers and several centuries, is a reminder that the state of unknown is not unusual in the archaeology of ancient cities. Many of the great urban centers of the ancient world are known to us through their physical remains, while the details of their internal life, their political structures, their religious beliefs, and their literary traditions remain largely or entirely inaccessible. The ancient city of Çatalhöyük in central Anatolia, Turkey, is in many ways the most remarkable early urban site yet discovered, and it is one that challenges the standard model of urban development in fundamental ways. Çatalhöyük was occupied from approximately 7,500 to approximately 5,700 years before the Common Era, a period of approximately 1,700 years, during which it was continuously inhabited by a population estimated at between 5,000 and 10,000 people. This makes it one of the largest communities in the world for its time. In the early and middle Neolithic period, several millennia before the development of the first Mesopotamian cities. The layout of Çatalhöyük is entirely unlike that of any other ancient city. The houses were built directly against each other, sharing walls with no streets or alleys between them. Access to individual houses was through holes in the roofs, reached by ladders. The entire settlement was a continuous mass of mud brick buildings, entered and navigated from above. This form of settlement, unique in the archaeological record, has stimulated considerable research and discussion about what social and functional logic might have produced it. The houses of Çatalhöyük were individually richly decorated, with plaster walls often painted with geometric designs or figurative images, including cattle, deer, and hunting scenes. The skulls of cattle were plastered into the walls in some houses, and small figurines, including the famous figurines of seated women that were once interpreted as representations of a mother goddess, were found throughout the site. Burials were made beneath the floors of the houses, with the dead kept in close physical proximity to the living in a way that is unusual in the archaeological record of the period. The social organization of Çatalhöyük appears to have been relatively egalitarian, based on the similarity of the houses in size and contents, and the absence of evidence for large, elaborately equipped residences of a kind associated with high-status individuals in more hierarchical societies. Isotope analysis of the skeletal remains indicates that the population had a diet similar to that of contemporary farming villages in the region, based primarily on wheat, barley, and sheep, with some wild plant and animal food supplementing the domestic diet. What is most surprising about Çatalhöyük is not any single feature, but the combination of large population, complex symbolic culture, and apparently non-hierarchical social organization that it represents. Most models of early urban development assumed that large settlements required hierarchical social organization, with elites who could coordinate and direct the activities of the population. Çatalhöyük suggests that large populations could live together and maintain a complex shared symbolic and material culture without developing the pronounced hierarchy associated with later urban civilizations. The mechanisms by which this was achieved, the social norms and practices that maintained community cooperation in the absence of obvious central authority, are a subject of ongoing research. The ancient megalithic tradition of Western Europe is another case in which the capabilities of early populations have consistently surprised researchers. The megaliths, the large stone monuments including standing stones, stone circles, and passage tombs, are distributed across Atlantic Europe from the Iberian Peninsula to Scandinavia, and they were built over a period of roughly 3,000 years, from approximately 4,500 to approximately 1,500 years before the Common Era. The most famous of them, Stonehenge in England and the Passage Tomb of Newgrange in Ireland, are well known, but they are only the most prominent examples of a tradition that left thousands of monuments across the Atlantic facade of Europe. The Passage Tomb of Newgrange in the Boyne Valley of Ireland was built approximately 5,100 years ago, making it somewhat older than the pyramids of Egypt. It consists of a large mound of earth and stone, approximately 80 meters in diameter and about 13 meters in height, enclosing a stone-built passage approximately 19 meters in length that leads to a cruciform chamber in the center of the mound. The stones used in the construction of the passage and chamber include some of very large size, transported from sources several kilometers away, and many of them are decorated with carved spiral and other geometric motifs. The most remarkable feature of Newgrange is its astronomical alignment. The entrance to the passage is oriented so that at the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, the rising sun shines directly into the passage and illuminates the chamber at its end for approximately 17 minutes around dawn. This illumination is accomplished through a small opening above the entrance called the roof box, which allows a narrow beam of light to enter the passage even when the entrance itself is sealed. The precision of this alignment, which is accurate to within a degree or two, indicates that the builders of Newgrange had a sophisticated understanding of the solar cycle and were capable of planning and executing a construction project that was designed to produce a specific astronomical effect. The builders of Newgrange were farmers, members of the early Neolithic farming communities that had arrived in Ireland from continental Europe several centuries before the tomb was built. They were not a complex civilization in the sense of having cities or writing or a differentiated economy of the kind associated with Mesopotamia or Egypt. They were farming communities, organized in relatively small groups. Without the elaborate social hierarchy or the dense urban population associated with the standard model of complex civilization. And yet they planned and built a monument whose orientation to the winter solstice required astronomical observation over multiple years, whose construction required the transport and careful placement of large stones, and whose roof box design required a sophisticated understanding of the geometry of light and passage that suggests considerable accumulated knowledge about the behavior of sunlight at different times of year. The megalithic tradition of Atlantic Europe was thus a form of complex cultural and technical achievement that does not fit neatly into the standard categories of civilizational development. A tradition of monumental construction and astronomical knowledge maintained by farming communities that lacked the urban and administrative complexity usually associated with comparable engineering achievements. It is another instance of the consistent finding that human capability for complex thought and complex coordination is not neatly bounded by the level of economic or political complexity of a society, and that the standard models of developmental sequence, in which certain capabilities are supposed to appear only at certain stages of social evolution, repeatedly underestimate what people at various stages of social development can accomplish. The study of ancient astronomical knowledge is itself a field that has revealed numerous examples of sophisticated observations and understandings among cultures that were not complex civilizations in the classical sense. The Polynesian navigators who settled the Pacific maintained a detailed knowledge of the positions and movements of stars that was sufficient to guide voyages of thousands of kilometers across open ocean. The Aboriginal Australians developed astronomical traditions that incorporated detailed knowledge of the movements of celestial bodies, the identification of dark nebulae in the Milky Way as the shapes of animals and other figures, and the use of astronomical cycles to organize seasonal activities and ceremonial calendars. These astronomical traditions were not preserved in written texts, but in oral traditions, songs, and ceremonies, forms of transmission that are less durable than writing, but that can maintain complex knowledge over many generations when the social structures that support them remain intact. The oral traditions of cultures without writing are another form of archive that has received insufficient attention in discussions of lost civilizations. The stories and songs and ceremonies of pre-literate cultures contain historical and ecological knowledge of great depth and sophistication accumulated over many generations and refined through the experience of living in particular landscapes over long periods of time. When the social structures that maintain oral traditions are disrupted by conquest, by epidemics, by forced resettlement, or by the suppression of indigenous languages and ceremonies, this knowledge can be lost far more quickly than the physical remains of a civilization, because it exists only in the minds and voices of living people. The loss of oral traditions in the wake of colonial disruption is one of the most significant and least recoverable losses in the history of human knowledge. Some of that knowledge has been partially preserved in the work of ethnographers and linguists who recorded oral traditions before they were entirely lost, but much has gone entirely. The knowledge of specific plant medicines, the detailed ecological understanding of particular landscapes, the historical accounts of events and processes going back many generations, all of this has been lost along with the languages and cultural structures that contained it. The civilizations that seem most thoroughly lost are often not the ones whose physical remains have been buried under soil and jungle, but the ones whose knowledge traditions were disrupted without any physical record being left at all. The recovery of indigenous knowledge traditions, where it is still possible, is an important part of the broader project of understanding the full range of human cultural and intellectual achievement. In some cases, the communities descended from ancient cultures are still present and still maintain some continuity with their ancestral traditions, even if that continuity has been disrupted and attenuated by historical trauma. The collaboration between archaeologists and descendant communities in the study of ancient sites has become increasingly common and increasingly productive, with indigenous knowledge informing the interpretation of archaeological evidence and archaeological findings, contributing to the historical understanding of descendant communities. The ancient cultures of the Pacific Northwest of North America present an example of a complex society that maintained itself for centuries without the urban infrastructure usually associated with civilization, based instead on the extraordinary richness of the marine and riparian resources of the region. The peoples of the Pacific Northwest developed complex social hierarchies, elaborate ceremonial traditions including the potlatch feasting system, sophisticated woodworking and weaving traditions, and rich oral literatures, all on the basis of an economy centered on the harvest of salmon and other marine resources rather than on agriculture. Their large, elaborately carved wooden houses and the totem poles that expressed their social and genealogical relationships were monumental in their own terms, even if they were made of wood rather than stone, and have therefore survived less completely than stone monuments. The Pacific Northwest cultures remind us that the standard definition of civilization, centered on agriculture, cities, and writing, may be too narrow to capture the full range of human cultural complexity. Societies based on intensive fishing and gathering can achieve levels of social differentiation, cultural elaboration, and specialized knowledge comparable to those of agricultural civilizations, and they may be better adapted to their specific environments, precisely because they do not attempt to transform those environments through agriculture. The diversity of pathways to complexity is one of the most important lessons of the comparative study of human cultures across time and space. The ancient cultures of Australia present a similar challenge to narrow definitions of civilizational complexity. The Aboriginal Australian traditions, which have maintained cultural continuity across at least 65,000 years, represent the longest continuous cultural tradition of any people on Earth. During that immense span of time, Aboriginal Australians developed a detailed and sophisticated understanding of the ecology of the Australian continent, a complex system of land management through the use of fire, elaborate ceremonial and symbolic traditions, including the songlines that encode geographical and ecological knowledge in the form of songs that can be followed across thousands of kilometers of landscape, and social structures that maintained peaceful relations among groups across very large areas through systems of kinship, exchange, and ceremonial obligation. The management of the Australian landscape through deliberate fire, practiced by Aboriginal Australians for tens of thousands of years, has been recognized by ecologists as one of the most significant examples of large-scale ecological management in human history. By burning vegetation at particular times and in particular patterns, Aboriginal Australians maintained a mosaic of habitats that supported much higher biological diversity than would have existed in either permanently unburned or continuously burned landscape. The composition of the Australian vegetation, the distribution of many plant species, and the populations of many animal species were all shaped by this millennia-long practice of fire management, to the point where the ecology of the continent cannot be fully understood without taking into account the role of Aboriginal land management. This deep human shaping of the Australian landscape, like the human shaping of the Amazonian forest, is invisible to observers who assume that natural environments are environments without human history. The recognition of this deep human presence in apparently natural landscapes is one of the more significant revisions in the understanding of global ecology over the past few decades, with implications not only for the history of human civilizations, but for the management of natural environments in the present. As this account moves toward its final reflections, it is appropriate to consider what the study of lost civilizations reveals about the nature of civilizational development more generally, about the conditions that support and the conditions that undermine complex human societies, and about what can be learned from the failures and the recoveries of the past. The recurrence of certain patterns in the history of lost civilizations is striking. The vulnerability of complex hydraulic systems to climatic variability is one such pattern, visible in the declines of Angkor, Tiwanaku, and many other civilizations that depended on carefully engineered water management systems to maintain their agricultural productivity. The susceptibility of densely populated urban systems to political fragmentation under conditions of resource stress is another, visible in the classic Maya collapse and in many other cases. The role of long-distance trade networks in both the success and the vulnerability of complex societies, providing essential resources and maintaining cultural connections, but also creating dependencies that can be disrupted by events far beyond local control, is a third. These patterns are not laws. They do not determine the fate of any particular civilization with certainty. But they are tendencies, regularities in the historical record that reflect the underlying logic of complex social systems. Complex societies are, by their nature, more capable than simple ones in many respects, better able to mobilize resources, to coordinate large-scale action, to produce and maintain sophisticated technology. But they are also more fragile in certain respects, more dependent on the maintenance of complex infrastructure and social arrangements that require continuous effort to sustain, more vulnerable to the disruption of the specific conditions that made their development possible. The resilience of human populations and cultures in the face of civilizational collapse is also a recurring theme in the history of lost civilizations. The people do not simply disappear when a civilization collapses. They disperse, adapt, or carry with them whatever knowledge and skills they can maintain, and eventually, under favorable conditions, contribute to the development of new forms of complexity. The population of the Indus Valley did not vanish when the Harappan cities were abandoned. They dispersed into smaller communities, and elements of Harappan culture, including ceramic traditions, craft techniques, and possibly aspects of religious practice, can be traced into the later cultural developments of the Indian subcontinent. The Maya who abandoned the great classic cities of the lowlands did not cease to exist. They moved, reorganized, and maintained Maya culture in highland and coastal regions, and the descendants of the classic Maya are still present in Mexico and Guatemala today. The recovery of memory, the slow work of archaeology and historical research that restores to the human record the knowledge of what was built and what was lost, is itself a form of resilience, a refusal to allow the forgetting that time imposes to be permanent. Each lost civilization recovered from obscurity adds to the collective understanding of what human beings have been and what they have been capable of, expanding the range of possibilities that inform the imagination of the present and the planning of the future. The places themselves, the ruins of the ancient cities, the earthworks in the Amazonian forest, the rock art of the Sahara, The passage tombs of Atlantic Europe, the great platforms of the Andes, remain in the landscape as quiet testimony to the depth of the human past. They are, in their silence, more eloquent than any summary account, because they represent the direct physical persistence of the effort and the ingenuity and the social cooperation of peoples who lived and worked and built in times so distant that their names are unknown and their words are inaccessible. The soil that covers them was once the floor of a house, the sediment of a harbor, the surface of a road. The stones that remain were cut and placed by hands that have long since returned to the earth. The alignment of a passage to the winter solstice, maintained across 5,000 years, is a message from people who calculated and planned and understood something precise and true about the movement of the heavens, a message that still delivers itself wordlessly in the beam of light that enters Newgrange on the morning of the solstice each year. These lost civilizations are, in the end, not lost at all. They are found, slowly and partially and with increasing care, by the generations of researchers and scholars and community members who have devoted themselves to the recovery of the human past. They are present in the landscape that they shaped, in the genes of the people who descend from them, in the crops and the animals, and the ecological patterns that they influenced over centuries of careful management. They are present in the knowledge traditions that survived, however attenuated, the disruptions of history, and in the oral traditions and ceremonial practices that have been maintained across generations in the face of every pressure to abandon them. And they are present in the quiet contemplation of what it means that human beings, across the full span of the time since the last ice age, have been building and thinking and organizing and creating in every landscape the Earth offered, in every climate the orbital cycles produced, with every resource the local environment provided. The diversity of the human response to the challenge of civilization, the extraordinary range of forms that complex human society has taken across time and space, is one of the most remarkable features of the natural history of our species. The lost civilizations that seemed at first encounter to be anomalies or impossibilities in the framework of accepted human history are, on reflection, simply the most interesting expressions of a universal human tendency toward the creation of complexity. They are the places where that tendency was expressed in unfamiliar forms, in environments that seemed unsuitable, at times that seemed too early, but in ways that did not fit the expected patterns. And they are, therefore, the places where the study of human civilization is most instructive, because they reveal the unexpected breadth of human possibility most clearly. The great city buried under the jungle, the raised fields of the high altiplano, the passage tomb aligned to the solstice sunrise, the geometric earthworks of the Amazon, the urban grid of the Indus Valley with its standardized bricks and its covered drains. All of these are human achievements of the first order, testifying to the intelligence and the social capability and the accumulated knowledge of the people who created them. They were lost for a time in the long interval between their flourishing and the development of the knowledge that could recover them, but they were never, in any final sense, gone. They were always there, in the ground, in the stone, in the soil chemistry, in the orientation of a passage toward the light, waiting, with the patient stillness of things that are very old, for the patient work of inquiry, to find them and to know them again. The earth holds a great deal of human history in its layers, far more than has yet been recovered, far more than the frameworks of any single era of scholarship have anticipated. The study of that history is a long, slow, and continuously surprising process, as full of discovery at its edges as the civilizations it studies were at theirs. And the story of lost civilizations, of the ancient worlds buried in the soil of the present world, is a story that is still being written carefully and patiently, by the people who dedicate themselves to the quiet work of understanding the deep past. The ruins stand as they have always stood, in the long afternoons of their ancient places, under the same sky that watched them being built, and the same turning of seasons that the people who built them marked and measured and aligned their great stones to receive. They are very old, and they are very quiet, and they hold in their silence the weight of everything that the human past contains.